The American Civil War was the great rupture of American society into two states, North and South, Union and Confederacy. And yet in this great conflict, this great American conflict, so many non-Americans took part that I thought it was worth exploring in a video series. And in today's episode, I'd like to look at the contribution of the Dutch in the American Civil War. Because it's estimated that anywhere from 600 to 700 born in the Netherlands Dutchmen took part in the American Civil War, some fighting for the South, the overwhelming majority fighting for the North, and some in companies that were almost exclusively made up of Dutchmen. And I thought that warranted its own video, so today I'll be looking at the Dutch in the American Civil War. So first of all, why were there Dutch people in America to begin with for the American Civil War? Well, we all know that the Dutch were the initial founders of New York. So yes, the Dutch had colonies in North America, but these were largely in the 17th century. They were later handed over or conquered by various powers, and so by the time of the American Civil War, the Dutch presence in America had really officially been gone for 200 years. However, we find more Dutch immigrants coming to North America in the course of the 19th century, especially after the 1834 Afscheiding, which was a split in the Reformed Dutch Church, the Protestant Church back home in the Netherlands, with several congregations and ministers deciding to leave that entity and to form their own churches instead. And often these are called seceders, and several of these people would move over to North America instead, fearing repression from the church in the Netherlands and sometimes even viewing the Dutch state as being inherently oppressive itself. By 1860, the census records that there were 28,281 people that were born in the Netherlands living in the United States. Of course, there will have been many more who had Dutch ancestors, particularly around the area of New York, but these would most likely consider themselves to be Americans now rather than Dutchmen. And so in this video, I'll be looking at those that were born in the Netherlands but fought in the American Civil War. We come across two states where we find most of these Dutch migrants living, and these are the states of Michigan and Iowa, the Midwest states, with several more living in the states around it as well. Now, we have several regiments and units that were partially made up of Dutchmen. Unlike the Irish and the Germans and several others, there were no specifically Dutch regiments because there simply weren't enough Dutchmen concentrated that were fighting in either army. However, we find some units that were largely Dutch or companies that were pretty much entirely Dutch. And some of those are the 1st Michigan Engineers and Mechanics, D Company of the 2nd Michigan Cavalry, the 25th Michigan Infantry, and specifically their I Company, which we'll hear a lot about in today's video. We also have the 24th Michigan Infantry, the 9th Michigan Volunteer Cavalry, and the G Company in the 33rd Iowa Infantry. Perhaps the largest sort of separate colony, and using that quote obviously not in a politically independent but rather a settlement term, of Dutchmen in the United States was around Holland in Michigan. This had been established in 1847 by the Reformed preacher Albertus van Raalte, who was one of those that split from the main Dutch Reformed Church with the Grote Afscheiding. He's a very important figure in this story, and he set about creating a colony with several villages named after provinces and towns in the Netherlands in this region of Michigan. It was quite an isolated community, far out from a lot of the other American settlements and settlements of other immigrants, and so it maintained a Dutch character for quite a while. Strict religion was the order of the day, and so they were very strictly reformed and would know more about the Bible and about religious matters than pretty much anything else. They also were pretty much all still speaking Dutch at this point. Most of them politically were supporters of the Democratic Party, as were most immigrants that came into the United States, as this party was pushing for naturalization against the Republican Party, for example. So what we read in Michael J. Daumer, who has done a very interesting thesis about the evolution of Dutch-American identities, he notes that Dutch Americans settled almost exclusively in non-slave states, and few, if any, supported the Confederate cause. The majority of them remained Democrats during the war and voted against Lincoln in both the 1860 and 1864 elections. The major Dutch-American newspaper at the time, De Hollander, was also a Democratic sheet. So politically, they were very much Democratic, and the Democrats were actually against the Civil War to begin with. However, Albertus, once the war was looking like it became inevitable, actually became a Republican instead and started to preach from his pulpit that the Dutch in this colony of Holland, Michigan, should go over and support the Republicans and support the war effort. So when war did break out, why did some of these very religious Dutchmen living far from the front lines decide to volunteer and join up? Well, the story is a little bit of a mixed bag. For one, we have that when the draft was looking like it was going to be introduced, there were several reasons why some of these Dutchmen decided to volunteer instead of being drafted. For one, this would spare other members of the community, including loved ones, from being forced to serve by them volunteering. Secondly, by volunteering, you got a $65 enlistment bonus. And the economic recession that had started in 1857 definitely helped to make this a more attractive offer to help the community back home. By volunteering, they could also serve alongside other Dutchmen in their own units, which for reasons I'll explore later on was very important for them. And as a final point, we've already come across Albertus giving these sermons in favor of the Republicans, but many Reformed churchmen became increasingly abolitionist or at least free soil as the nation went towards war, denouncing both the evils of slavery and of Southern secession and the need to help the Union in their struggle, and this probably convinced quite a few of the volunteers that it was worth doing. However, it should also be noted that quite a few members of the community actually actively tried to escape conscription. Some gave the reason that they were not American citizens but Dutch citizens, and even wrote to consuls and embassies to bring forth proof so that they wouldn't be brought into the army. Others actually left the community entirely and went over the border into Canada to escape for the war years. And others still had moral objections to fighting in the war, as the consensus on slavery was not entirely equal throughout these Dutch communities, some seeing it as a necessary evil or something that did not concern them, while others thought that it was a moral blight that had to be got rid of. And of course, at the start of the war, the main aim wasn't to end slavery, but to bring the South back into the fold. By and large, the communities in Holland, Michigan, and some similar ones in Iowa did not see themselves as American citizens, but rather as Dutch Reformed citizens that were living in the United States, and so might not have seen this as their fight. Furthermore, they were very heavily inclined towards the community and so did not want to be away from farms and families for too long, which serving in the army would mean. Now, we have a lot of information actually about why a lot of these individuals went and served and some of the background information about them, particularly for that Dutch ethnic unit, the Company I of the 25th Michigan Infantry. And what we know is that they started to recruit on the 14th of August 1861, and one of the very first volunteers was none other than the son of Albertus von Raalte, the founder of the colony, who was named Benjamin von Raalte. And we know that only a few days later, on the 20th of August 1862, his 18-year-old younger brother, Dirk von Raalte, also signed up. So the two brothers signed up together. And before long, there were 75 men that had enlisted from the community, thus forming Company I in the 25th Michigan. Now, what's very interesting is that 59 of those 75 were between the ages of 17 and 19. So this was an incredibly young unit going to war, which perhaps also says something about the motivation, which may have been that sense of adventure, the younger wanderlust, or perhaps the idea that some of these younger men might have felt more of an association with their new home country than the older men who had lived for longer in the Netherlands rather than in America. On the 8th of January 1863, the 25th, including the Dutch Company I, went into battle for the first time against the Confederates under General Pegram in Kentucky, and they won the day. They drove the Confederates from the field, which was a great boon for their morale. They continued to campaign here in the Western Theatre, and we know a little bit about some of the fighting that occurred from a letter written by Alexander Jonkier, who writes in June of 1863, "I was fighting from 4:30 a.m. to past 8 at night, and a lot of men in our company fell. Our colonel was proud of us and the way we fought." Another account that survives from the 24th of November 1863 that he wrote describes how some were wounded but no one was killed. We fought well. Of the rebels, there were 200 dead. We were in good position to fight. We could see them well, and it was good to see them retreat. Noting in November more successes against the rebels. Now they continued to fight into 1864 when they were heavily involved under General Sherman around the rebel stronghold of Atlanta, getting involved in the siege and several of the battles around it, particularly at the Battle of Utoy Creek, where we know that the Company I was engaged in the inconclusive fighting that happened there, but that their color bearers were both shot down by the Confederates and they had to leave their regimental and national colours lying on the field of battle. However, from another account by Alexander Jonkier and later stories, we know that this was a great dishonour to leave the regimental colours on the field of the previous day's fight. And so from later stories, we understand that Benjamin von Raalte, who we've already encountered, snuck through the Confederate lines at night and so brought the two flags back to the company so that they can carry it into battle. And that since that day, he was the one that carried the colours as the colour bearer and would carry them throughout the rest of the war and indeed on parade as well. We also have a story about his younger brother Derek, who was writing dispatches for the company when in a wooded area outside of Atlanta he was ambushed by rebel guerrillas. His horse reared up and went backwards instead of forwards when he spurred it on, and so he ended up being shot in the arm. The surgeons, when he rode safely back into camp, decided to amputate his arm, and so he lost his limb, but forever afterwards, whenever he rode, he would ride on a black horse, given that it was a black horse that had ridden him to safety, perhaps even a Frisian, who knows. We get a sense that this was a very dangerous time to be a member of the 25th, as they were deep in enemy territory, and we have this account that survives of some of the dangers that they faced, which was written by someone who signed off the letters as LCH, and having looked through the roster of men, I'm not sure exactly which of the men that would be, but he writes on the 6th of November in 1864 that I was unable to keep up with the regiment, and in company of Corporal George Westover of Company G and Sergeant Otto Boat of Company I and several others, we crossed Piney Creek. When about a quarter of a mile from the creek, 25 or 30 guerrillas suddenly dashed upon us from a bend in the road. They fired upon us and demanded us to surrender. He continues and describes what happened. I had a watch and 2 pocketbooks, one containing $3 in my right hand pocket and the other containing $40 in the other. They asked me for my watch and pocketbook. I gave them my watch and the pocketbook containing $3. 4 guerrillas now took the 6 of us round by a creek and into a deep ravine. Here they halted us and ordered us to turn our backs. I said, "For God's sake, don't shoot us so." These words were hardly out of my mouth when they fired. Now, Otto Boat and the other men in the unit that had fallen behind of Company G were killed, Otto Boat being one of the Dutchmen from Company I. But this anonymous source was able to escape and so to tell the tale of their encounter with these Confederate bushwhackers. Now, the 25th went on serving with General Sherman in the South, moving forward with him as he advanced into Georgia and beyond around Atlanta, and until the end of the war in 1865, when we know that the company was disbanded, discharged from service on the 9th of April, free to return home. That was the account of what we know that the 25th Michigan was up to during the war, but we know of other individual Dutchmen who served alongside Americans and those of other other nationalities, and probably the majority of Dutchmen that took part in the war were in very mixed units together with other people, where there probably were no other or only a few other Dutchmen, making it really hard to trace. However, we do know of a couple of Dutchmen that faced off against one another at probably the most famous battle of the Civil War at Gettysburg. One of them was Private Nicolaas Huyks, who was part of the 82nd New York Infantry. Although he had been born in the Netherlands, he had gone over to New York. However, the battle did not go well for him, and on the 2nd of July, he was killed in action. Another was Private Daniel Schout, who was part of the 108th New York Infantry. We know that Daniel was wounded on the 3rd of July, so the day after that Huyks was killed. And it's possible that he is somewhere in this photograph, as this is a picture from 1887 of a reunion at the Battle of Gettysburg of the 108th shown here. Another soldier from the Netherlands that fought at the Battle of Gettysburg on the Union side was Sake Koistra, which I find very interesting because that is a Frisian surname, and actually the same surname as quite a few of my own Frisian ancestors have. So possibly this is a relation of mine distantly, although of course Koistra is quite a popular surname in Friesland. And we actually do know quite a bit more about this character from both before and during the war, and so I won't say much more about that, but I would like to look more in depth at that in another video about him and another Frisian soldier that we know fought in the American Civil War and at the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, so far, I've really only spoken about Dutch soldiers that fought on the Union side, the northern side in the Civil War. However, after doing quite a bit of digging, I was able to find some information about Dutchmen who fought for the other side, who fought for the South or the Confederate States. One such was Private Jacob R. Pollack, who had been educated at the University of Leiden in the Netherlands, and it seems that he was himself also Dutch, and that he signed up with the 1st Virginia Infantry already in 1861 as he had settled down in Richmond, which became the capital of the Confederacy. He was wounded at the Battle of Second Manassas in 1862, and we actually know that he committed himself with great bravery as he was part of the doomed Pickett's charge at the Battle of Gettysburg. When the colour standard bearer of his regiment was shot down in front of him, he rushed to pick up the standards and to carry them forth in the charge, an act which was honoured with him being made a sergeant major following the battle, although we know that he left the army in 1864 and later settled down in Atlanta. Another Dutchman fighting on the Confederate side at Gettysburg was Private John H. Walters, who served in the Norfolk Artillery Blues, an artillery regiment from the town of Norfolk in Virginia. Even though he had first moved to Albany when he came to the United States, he later worked as a bookbinder, working mainly in Virginia, and then joined the artillery, although the artillery of his battalion wasn't engaged in the Battle of Gettysburg itself. Another Dutchman that wasn't at Gettysburg, but we know was a very adamant supporter of the Confederacy, was Charles Learner, who had emigrated to New Orleans and who describes in several letters about his support for not only the Confederacy but also the institution of slavery, seeing it as a natural order of things. And he also mentions that there were many other Dutch people living in New Orleans at the time, some of whom served with him as an engineer in the Confederate Army. So he wasn't actually at the front line so much, but he was more working on railroads and things like that behind the lines, although he was a committed Confederate supporter. He would later actually move back to Europe, moving to England, to the Netherlands, and to Germany, and a twist of irony is that his daughter, in the wake of the Second World War, would attempt to get a pass to go back to the United States, mentioning her father's service for that country, although conveniently ignoring the fact that it had been for the Confederates rather than for the Unions. But that's history for you. So having looked at some of the military engagements that the Dutch were involved in, what do we know about what these volunteers actually felt about the war and about what they were doing? Can we get a sort of insight into their mindset, into their souls whilst they were on campaign? Well, luckily we can a little bit. One interesting thing is that a lot of the ones, especially looking at those serving in the more Dutch groupings from Iowa and from Michigan is that most of them were still Dutch speakers, and quite a lot of them probably barely spoke any English, because most of these communities, these very religious communities they came from, were very insular and didn't have very much contact outside of that sort of Dutch colonial bubble. And so for a lot of them, actually being together was very important, because it created this sort of sense of a Dutch Reformed community, even within the army, within I Company, for example. Of course, they would have to have learned English to understand the commands and to interact with other soldiers. But I thought that was an interesting element. We actually find out an awful lot about this because they were very good at writing letters and delivering them back to the home front, to their families back in the Midwest. And from this, we can glean quite a lot about things that they were concerned about. Particularly the Dutch soldiers from Michigan seem to have been concerned with religious matters, writing a lot of the time about these as they're sending letters back. And particularly in the juxtaposition of themselves and of others in the camp, the sort of sinful life of the camp, while they were more concerned with biblical matters and with attending mass and all of these kinds of things. One Dutch fighter wrote, who was called Willem Roon, was very excited that he had met a Dutch preacher from Cincinnati, but complained about all the sinful things that were happening in the camp, which we can only imagine the kinds of things he was referring to. Another Dutch soldier called Jan Nies, who was serving with the 2nd Michigan Cavalry, has written quite a lot of letters that we still have today. And he writes some very interesting things, writing about the hearth and home that he can still remember even while on campaign, highlighting the importance of community for these men. He says, "Although we are divided from each other by a great distance, and now for a long time as well, yet house and home cannot and shall never, I think, be forgotten." In other letters, he also writes about learning new things, seeing new places, and understanding more about the country in which they live. A real experience for a lot of these very young men who would for the first times really be moving out of their communities and seeing larger parts of America, apart from when they had initially moved to the Americas as young children. Some of these letters would be also published in Dutch language newspapers that were produced in Michigan and Iowa, such as the Grondwet. And we can only imagine that news being sent in these letters to individual soldiers would be shared around Company I and other such units for other Dutchmen to keep up with the news in the local community, and also vice versa, that back home this news from the front would be shared from Dutch soldiers there. What's very interesting actually is this idea that this Dutch community did really stay in touch even on the front line, as Wolf van Apeldoorn, who was one of the members of Company I in the 25th Michigan, actually describes how that other soldier that I mentioned, Jan Nies, who was with the 2nd Michigan Volunteer Cavalry, actually came and visited Company I whilst on the front line to catch up with his fellow Dutchmen in this unit, which just goes to show that that sense of community was really still there even on the front lines. Although what's also interesting to realize is that they never really sought out other Dutchmen outside of these Reformed Dutch communities. There was never any sort of connivance with Dutch Catholics, which were also in the United States, or Dutch Jews, which we have other examples of fighting in other units alongside others. But it's very interesting that they do maintain these connections within the Dutch Reformed sphere on the front line. It's particularly interesting that the Civil War experience of these young men really helped to create a mixed American-Dutch identity in those units that fought, and also when they came back, as they were forced to see more of the country and indeed to meet Americans from all over, well, particularly the north of the United States and later also from the south. One interesting way that we can see this Americanization in progress is how one of the soldiers from Company I would sign off his letters. He started off signing it off with John van Lente. So John, obviously the English way of writing the name, but the van Lente with the lowercase v is the Dutch way of doing it. Then, at the early part of the war when he's away, he actually becomes more Dutch in his name, Johannes van Lente. Possibly this is because of exposure to new and foreign elements and being together with other Dutch soldiers, making him highlight his Dutchness. However, a little bit later in the war, he actually writes his name a little bit differently. He spells his first name differently, Johannes, which may possibly be an indication of a different way that he was starting to pronounce his name, although that's just my reading of it. But interesting again is that he now spells his surname with a capital V in the American way of spelling a surname rather than the Dutch name. Now, at the end of the war, he goes back to John or Jon. We're not actually sure how he pronounced that particularly, but he keeps the capital V with that Americanized capital V in the surname. So that's quite interesting to show sort of a process of Americanization that these young men were going through. From that same thesis about the Dutch-American identity, there's also an interesting point that is raised by Michael Dauma, who says, many Dutch immigrant men, however, avoided citizenship to escape military conscription during the Civil War, as I had mentioned a little bit earlier. Through their participation of the Civil War, in the passing of generations and through Americanization in school and society, Dutch Americans began to see American citizenship and an associated patriotic nationalism as essential components of their identities. And one of the key catalysts of this were the returning young men who had served in the Union Army who came back to their communities. One interesting impact of the war that we see is that actually 7 pensions were being paid out to the widows of disabled veterans, all of whom lived in the Netherlands. So this perhaps suggests that some of these men did move back to the Netherlands after their service, and we have in the records evidence of where this was in particular places in the Netherlands, which is quite interesting. And these are only the disabled ones, as these were the only pensions being paid out in the first place. We do also come across our favourite 2 brothers, the Van Raalte brothers of Benjamin and Dirk, who are described a little bit later on, I think, by Jan Nies. Now, he says that the men-at-arms returned to become business leaders and often progressive-minded thinkers who challenged local orthodoxy. Historian Herbert Brinks has written that Dutch-American soldiers, by participating in the war, became more unreservedly American than their relatives and friends on the home front, which is perhaps what we're seeing in the way that they started to spell their names differently. The Civil War Americanized the Dutch soldiers, but their new American ways were sometimes unwelcome in their home communities. Holland's Ray Nies put it another way. I recall 2 brothers, sons of a prominent pious citizen, who returned home, the one minus an arm, the other with no body disablement, but enriched with a great vocabulary of American cuss words, which he constantly employed. The good father must have felt as much sorrow over the one as the other. One had both arms and swore, the other had but one arm and did not swear. Now, of course, we know from the letters being sent home by the brothers that these are the Van Raalte brothers, and the prominent citizen is Albertus Van Raalte, and we can really sort of see this dynamic in front of us of the 2 brothers who have been away and have experienced this new sort of American culture coming back to their strictly religious, conservative Dutch Reformed community with all these new words effing and jeffing and coming along, and how that might then be perceived as they return home. But it paints a really vivid image of the Civil War's effect on those who had served, but also on the home front, and how this challenged their idea of an ethnic and religious identity model and started that process of Americanization in the Dutch American community. But let me know, what do you think about the Dutch involvement in the American Civil War? I thought this was a really interesting little tidbit of history because I really hadn't found anything out about this before I started looking it up as a part of this series. I would highly recommend, if you are very interested in this topic, then reading that thesis, which I found incredibly interesting, by Michael Dauma, or maybe Michael Dauma. I don't know if this is a Dutch American or a Dutchman who has written this, but I found that was a very interesting source. I'll link a few other articles and things in the description below if you want to find out more. There's an awful lot of information on the internet about different regiments and rosters, and going through there, especially those from Michigan, you see a lot of Dutch surnames. Now, in other places in the United States, especially sort of New York area, it's harder to track people based on their surname because, of course, there were many Dutch that settled there in the 17th century and afterwards, which were probably Americanized at that point rather than being Dutchmen. But it's likely that some of them, as we saw with the Dutch at Gettysburg, were also involved in the New York regiments that went and fought and were actually born in the Netherlands. But unless they noted that down, they sort of disappear into these larger units. Anyway, let me know if you found this interesting. Which other immigrant groups would you like me to make a video about fighting in the American Civil War? And stay tuned for the Frisians in the American Civil War video, which I'll have up at some point in the future. Anyway, until then, I have been Hilbert, and this has been The History.